오투투를 활용한 문장 20가지를 다음과 같이 제공합니다.
1. You ought to apologize for what you said. 2. She ought to focus more on her studies. 3. We ought to help those in need. 4. They ought to reconsider their decision. 5. He ought to seek medical advice for his condition. 6. You ought to respect other people's opinions. 7. Jane ought to visit her relatives during the holidays. 8. He ought to take a break and relax. 9. They ought to be more considerate towards others. 10. We ought to save money for emergencies. 11. She ought to exercise regularly for better health. 12. You ought to attend the meeting tomorrow. 13. He ought to read more to improve his vocabulary. 14. They ought to spend less time on social media and more time with friends. 15. We ought to be grateful for what we have. 16. She ought to pursue her dreams without fear. 17. You ought to clean your room before guests arrive. 18. They ought to volunteer at the local charity organization. 19. He ought to quit procrastinating and start working on his project. 20. You ought to appreciate the beauty of nature.